everyone ask that if everyone could stay on mute until we open it up for comments later, I would greatly appreciate that. Thank you very much. And now I'll hand it over to Vladimir and Jack to begin the presentation. Gentlemen.
Well, Terence, thank you very much. I'll introduce myself briefly, and then I'll let Vladimir introduce himself in about 5 to sort of 10 minutes when I shut up. I feel like in some ways I feel both an imposter, but also a little bit very sympathetic talking to the Society of Decision Professionals. And the reason I feel like an imposter is I'm not a member, and most of what I've done over the last 15 years, I would say, or 20 years, has not been formally related to decision theory. So most of the last 15 years, if I'd been on your side, if I'd been on the American side of the Atlantic, I'd have been a Wall Street analyst. So I've been a drug and biotech analyst covering drug and biotech stocks, mostly European ones, working first for a company called Sanford Bernstein, which was based out of New York, and then more recently running the European team at UBS. But I quit that late last year, partly because I've had a long-standing side interest in R&D productivity, which has brought me quite close to decision theory. And in fact, it was applying decision theoretic principles to drug R&D that made me decide not to work in investment anymore and do something more interesting. And as part of that more interesting, I wrote a paper which probably came out about 10 weeks ago on a slight uptick in R&D productivity. And someone I'd never heard of called Vladimir Schneidman on LinkedIn started sending me lots and lots of irritating but very, very good questions. And I kept answering them, and he kept sending more and more. So in the end, I said, look, let's have a chat about this. And I met him and was remarkably sympathetic and impressed by most of what he said. And then he introduced me to the idea of applying Monte Carlo simulations to the COVID-19 vaccines portfolio. And again, a lot of what I've done over the last 15 years has been trying to model the portfolios of drug companies. And the moment Vladimir said we should apply some Monte Carlo type simulation methods to this, I instantly couldn't believe the way I'd been doing it for the last 15 years. Because when you work in investment, we spend an awful lot of time modeling drug company portfolios, but we use these rather, in retrospect, simple sort of expected NPV methods and just sort of forecasting a bunch of products on a probability adjusted basis and adding them up. And I'm actually surprised at myself that I did it so long, because I have over the years done a bunch of Monte Carlo simulations, and I was a mathematical biologist years ago. So in a sense, I was using sort of Monte Carlo simulations to model cancer trials as part of my day job, but it never occurred to me to do something more sensible when looking at the R&D portfolios of drug companies. So anyway, that's the sort of preamble. So if we go on to slide 1, or slide 2 rather, just forward 1 slide, please. So 3 good reasons for COVID-19 vaccine portfolio simulation. Well, when I worked as an investment analyst, the reasons I had for analyzing portfolios were not nearly as good as the reasons that one might have now. So now, for example, I would quite like to be able to go out of my house and do things. And that is in some ways related to item 1, right, which is portfolio risk management. So there is an enormous amount of activity at the moment going on to develop vaccines. I suspect some of it has been designed on at least some kind of considered portfolio basis. If I think about what I imagine BARDA and then Operation Warp Speed in the US is doing, I think they probably have thought about diversification and risk management, but it's not clear to me that the rest of the world has. I think if I look at the rest of the world, what I see is a lot of national champions, right? It's what's the first thing we can put into development rather than what is the thing we can put into development that might hedge global risk or minimize the chance that we don't have anything in 1, 2, or 3 years' time. But there's a second constituency that I think is very interested in having good probabilistic models with confidence intervals, and that is people involved in policy development. So, for example, lots of countries are going to be scratching their heads thinking, at what point is it reasonable to believe there will be a vaccine, right? Or should we just continue to behave as if there won't be and invest in expensive, long-lived public health measures that we may have to spend an awful lot of money to build if we think they're going to last the next 5 years, right? Or actually, can we just kludge together a bunch of stuff because in 18 months' time or 2 years' time, we can be confident that there's a vaccine that's going to dig us out of the hole. Another reason that you might want a good probabilistic portfolio view is that in 6 months or 12 months' time, countries are going to have to start thinking about the practicalities of immunizing tens of millions, hundreds of millions, or if they're China, billions of people, right? And you will want a probabilistic view at that stage of the clinical characteristics of the kind of vaccine you might get, and the vaccines in the pipeline have different clinical characteristics, right? So some of them you might have to give to people twice. Some of them might require a cold chain. Some of them might be a bit risky, so you'd only give them to high risk groups, right? So there's going to be different options for vaccine deployment depending on the safety and efficacy profile of the vaccines. And then the third reason you want portfolio simulation is it's really, really complicated. When I started working on this with Vladimir, probably 6 weeks ago, possibly less, there were about 70 or maybe 80 candidates. There's 130 now. They're spread across at least 8 different vaccine technologies. And that's even if you're rather crude about lumping the technologies together, right? So actually there's quite a lot of diversity within each of those different technical platforms. There's a huge degree of uncertainty. And then there's another issue which the policy folks are particularly interested in, which is what you might call therapeutic nationalism, right? So actually the portfolio isn't global, or at least it won't be at first, right? Because you're likely to have manufacturing constraints. So the compounds that BARDA has paid for in the US are unlikely to be available for everyone else in the world until the US feels that its domestic demand has been satisfied, right? So there's a whole bunch of kind of complicated problems. Next slide, please. So this is happening not a bit faster than usual. It's also happening much, much faster than usual. So historically, I'm being generous here to say that vaccine development normally takes more than 10 years. Often it takes 20. And there's a whole bunch of pathogens around HIV, for example, malaria, where, you know, the first vaccine was in 1720, right? And we still don't have vaccines for those diseases. So, you know, this is not necessarily a quick process. And in the right panel, what you can see is that the traditional serial steps that people use are now being largely compressed, run together and run in parallel. That's the bottom part of the right panel, right? So people are doing clinical trials before they finished what would historically have been the preclinical development. They're starting phase 2 before they finished phase 1. Manufacturing is starting to ramp up already before we've got phase 1, phase 2 data, right? So there's a whole bunch of stuff happening in parallel which never happened before. Next slide, please. And again, just thinking briefly about the vaccine diversity, and I won't talk about this to a great deal, but there is unfortunately something of a negative correlation between the vaccines that are quick, cheap, and easy to manufacture and the vaccines that no one has ever brought to market before, right? So the tried and tested methods are things like inactivated virus, weakened virus, protein subunits, and those are the things where the world's got most experience. And certainly some of those technologies are probably technologies where it would take longer to ramp up manufacturing. And there's a great deal of excitement about some of the novel technologies like DNA and RNA-based vaccines, which in principle one may be able to manufacture and deploy much more quickly. But the trouble is, at least as a first approximation, no one has ever brought those vaccines to market before, right? So here's another difficult trade-off that countries have. You've got tried and tested technologies that we know work, but are probably slow. And we've got novel technologies no one's ever done before, but they're probably quicker. Next slide, please. So this is really to remind me, I don't expect anyone to have good enough eyesight necessarily to see the detail here. But again, I'll draw your attention to the prior slide saying this normally takes 10 years. What we've got here are some of the leading candidates that are in clinical trials. And we've got people running phase 1, phase 2 trials in parallel, and people expecting to have what they call emergency use authorization. So this is some sort of provisional approval after phase 2, and some of these candidates expect to have that sometime this year, right? So there's also all sorts of questions about what do you do with a vaccine that has emergency use authorization, right? Probably you don't give it to everyone, right? You might just want to give it to high-risk groups at first, or effectively run a very large phase 3 trial, because again, if one thinks about correlated risk, if one did put out one of these vaccines and it ended up being dangerous, right, that's not just a problem for it, it's a problem for the clinical trial programs of the other vaccines, and it's also a problem for the deployment of the other vaccines, right? So there's a whole bunch of sort of interrelated risks one has to worry about. Next slide, please, Vladimir.
Yeah, before I go to the next slide, I would say this diagram could be obsolete in the next 5 days. Just don't take it seriously. It's just
yeah, this was probably as of a week ago, so it's probably almost certainly obsolete now.
Yeah, just we cannot kind of.
And then a little bit about, again, I think this is an interesting practical problem that we are at least starting to think about how to address when we model this. But for a lot of the policy folks, the fact that not everyone will have access to everything at the same time is a big deal. So again, my view actually is the US is taking is at least taking a very thoughtful approach to managing some of the risks, right? And is putting a diverse set of vaccines, or BARDA and the Warp Speed program are supporting a diverse set of vaccines, which hopefully will sort of diversify some of the technical risk. Now, of course, there may be risk associated with doing it so quickly that is correlated. But nonetheless, if one looks at most of the rest of the world, with the exception of China, so China's backing a relatively small number of candidates where actually there's a lot of concentration of risk. A lot of the Chinese candidates have similar technology. And then if you look at Europe and much of the rest of the world, well, you know, it's not clear that, you know, what or when we'll have access to. So the UK, there's a vaccine out of Oxford partnered with AstraZeneca that's getting a huge amount of press coverage. But, you know, if that blows up, it's not immediately clear to me where the UK will source vaccines from. So what we're trying to model is the sort of the domicile of the vaccines and the rate at which they will spread out of their countries of origin. And I think at that point, I hand over to Vladimir, who's going to start talking about the analysis and what we've actually done.
Thank you, Jack. Great, great thing. And it's some of you probably know me for my irritating comments and portfolio management exercises. And when this pandemic started, and I randomly kind of read some paper about vaccines development, and I kind of realized that this is portfolio, and we have to find way how to what to do with that, and what would be the biggest challenge for this portfolio. It's not there was no data. Nothing we could apply to do some sort of traditional portfolio analysis. We could not calculate NPV, and we could not we could not say cost effectiveness analysis, etc., etc. And our biggest challenge is to get data and to calculate portfolio risk and to make some conclusions about portfolio productivity. And we're not talking about portfolio productivity like overall portfolio productivity, but we're talking about portfolio productivity and risk in a given time frame from 12 to 18 months, like many political forces, they told us that vaccines should be done in 12, 18 months. And this result is a little bit different from what was expected. I read numerous papers where people made some sort of very simplistic calculations, even for very conservative likelihood of success, approval, multiplied by number of vaccine programs, we should have 6-7 vaccines. It sounds very simple and very promising, but how reality correlates with this kind of statements. And let me kind of try to formulate more focused questions. Is there any risk of zero approvals in 12-18 months based on our current knowledge of vaccines portfolio? What are probabilities that at least one COVID vaccine is approved within 18 or 24 months? Would managing COVID vaccine portfolio on a global rather than company level or national basis reduce probability of zero approvals within 24 months? And we can continue asking these questions again and again and again, and many others. And let me try to kind of what we could extract, to share with you what we could extract from this kind of zero knowledge and a lot of huge uncertainty. This is our challenges. Like Jack mentioned, this is a highly dynamic portfolio. Mid-April, 80 programs or 70 programs. May 12th, 133 programs, 133 programs. Different sources give us different numbers. Even size of the portfolio is very uncertain. Very limited and sometimes controversial data based on guesstimates, previously published research, informal discussion, etc., etc. For example, Clarivate Analytic estimated vaccine approval in 5 years at least, and others gave very different kind of assessment, and no economics, no value to each program. And for example, probability of success is the same for all vaccines. It's in bio.org 2016 report. And there was no probability of success for COVID-19 at all. And how to build model in such conditions? Of course, we used traditional formalization as decision trees, and we used kind of for multiple programs decision trees. But what is important here, and what I already kind of implemented once is program interdependence in simulators. And input is just information about what is available, and output is output of the model is portfolio risk and productivity. And I'm sure everybody is familiar with decision trees. I don't need to kind of to go in details. And what is also important in decision trees that we characterized cycle times for each phase of clinical trial, and it's different. Input data, what we put in our model. First of all, the entire portfolio of COVID vaccines. We used generic data in our current release, because and we at some point we were lucky to have almost all candidates in preclinical, and it helped us to kind of to parameterize each candidate. But in the future, this approach probably might not work. And calculations were done for 80 programs. We consider it as a baseline scenario. 75 are in preclinical development, 4 in phase 1, and 1 is in phase 1/2. And also we use phase-specific cycle time, phase-specific probabilities of success. And our biggest challenge is probabilities of success. For example, Bio 2016 gives this set of probabilities for the entire vaccine family, for all vaccines, HIV, whatever, for all of them, and likely. And another source gave us likelihood of approval is about 16%. It was published in Lancet in 2018, and preclinical was given in the range from 41% to 57%, which is kind of more or less in range. But overall, in other sources gives us likelihood of approval within between 6 and 9%. At the same time, latest paper published by MIT researchers gave likelihood of approval for vaccines. They call it pretty close to COVID. COVID is about 40%. You see a huge range of different kind of vaccines probabilities, and it also didn't help. Now let's talk what we could kind of get out of it. First is we used portfolio simulator, and we used and those results are for our baseline scenario. If we remove time factor, we would get this kind of risk profile. It means that we will get vaccine because approval. And again, forget about time for a second. And if we will get one approval with almost zero risk. We're lucky. And then we'll get more approvals, and the risk level will also be higher and higher. For example, like 10 vaccines will be associated with risk about more than 80%. But society requires a little bit different thing. Similar risk profile for interval from 12 to 18 months looks very different, and it shows us that according to our data, about 40 there will be zero approval with risk about 40%. It means that with risk 40%, we will not get vaccine within 12 to 18 months. It sounds a little bit scary. For 19 to 24 months, risk profile is a little bit better. We will risk of zero approvals is pretty small. And we will, and according to it means that period from 12 to 18 months sounds kind of very aggressive based on our data. And this is our baseline scenario as it was at the middle of April. Then we started thinking, okay, what if we increase size of the portfolio? Simulator actually mimicked situation which already happened, and we increased our portfolio size from 80 to 120. We did not predict that it would be 133 candidates, and we could see that that risk of approval will be risk of zero approval will be reduced from 40% to 30%. If our portfolio will be increased to 120, and probably in 133 it will be reduced a little bit more, and we will see. And this is kind of also I would say not very favorable result, because how many companies will participate in this race? We need to do something more specific and make this model more accurate. Now let's talk a little bit about also the same experiments we did from 19 to 24 months. Risk profile is a little bit better. For example, risk is relatively small for portfolio of 120 candidates. It's a green line on your computers, and you could see, but it's still kind of risk is pretty much sizable, and we definitely need a vaccine as soon as possible. Then we also tried to do some sort of sensitivity analysis. What we did, we changed cycle time, just removed 1 month out of our cycle time. We increased probability of success by 10%, and of course increased size of the portfolio. And all combination of these factors brought us some sort of best case scenario in terms of risk profile. According to this, we will have a relatively low risk of zero approval, and one vaccine will be at least one vaccine will be approved with risk about maybe 20–25%, etc., etc. And it means that definitely there are factors which could affect our productivity results and risk profile. And our next steps, and we are working on it. Our team is already includes 5 people around the globe. Actually, it's United States, United Kingdom, and Canada. Canada. First of all, we definitely need to make better parameterization of the model, and our efforts are in differentiated cycle times for different platforms and leading candidates. And second pieces, which is very important, elicitation of probabilities of success across platforms and candidates. And a third piece is interdependence between candidates within platform. And we also are going to monitor portfolio risk profile to see how we can do it. And those are a couple of references. We published recently a paper online in Applied Clinical Trials, and more about simulator is in my paper in Journal of Commercial Biotechnology. And that's pretty it. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, and we hope if you can contribute to this process. We're happy to get your feedback. Thank you.
Gentlemen, thank you very much for that presentation. And now we'll open it up for questions. So anybody wanting to ask a question, just go ahead and unmute yourself and go ahead.
Hi, this is Jay Anderson. I think your work is very good. I have a couple of observations. Jackie mentioned in some of your comments early on that the situation is changing so much that the number of vaccines in development now is substantially larger than it was just a few weeks ago. That's another thing I think you could consider modeling, that increase in new vaccines popping into the preclinical stage of development is likely to continue to increase, and you might be able to model that in some kind of time series fashion to make certain assumptions about how rapidly will the growth of new vaccine candidates grow over the next 6 to 12 months. So that's observation one. Second observation, because of the severity of the pandemic, I suspect that the probability of, quote, success, unquote, or approval, if you will, for the earliest candidates will be higher than for subsequent candidates. And that's because I believe that regulators will not have as stringent of requirements for what a vaccine needs to establish to get approved as you've seen with historical probabilities. I believe the historical probabilities are pretty low compared to this situation as far as what criteria would be deemed acceptable for an approval. So some of the candidates that are most further along in development, you might consider giving them some kind of bump up in probability, because I believe, at least for the first few candidates, there'll be a lower bar just so that they can get something out there that's safe and somewhat effective.
Okay, so two comments. I'll try and answer them both, and then Vladimir. But so in terms of the first one, I think you've identified something which is a real sort of practical modeling issue that we're scratching our heads about, actually how best to do it. Because at the moment, you've got maybe 8 or 9 candidates in phase 1 trials, and you've got roughly 120, 130 in preclinical development. If you simply flow that through the model in a sort of naive way, what happens is the stuff in preclinical development about which we currently know very, very little dominates the output, right? Because, you know, the probability of something in phase 1, let's say getting to the end, is 20%. The probability of something in preclinical getting to the end is 10%. But if you've got 13 times as many things in preclinical development as in phase 1, your forecast tends to be dominated by the stuff in preclinical development, which is the stuff about which you've got the least information, right? So we have been scratching our heads and thinking about sensible ways of thinking. How does that stuff in preclinical, how should we flow that through the model? And if anyone's got a brilliant idea how to do it, then, you know, I'd be delighted if you could let us know. But I think that does require serious thought. And then, of course, there's dependencies over time, right? So if stuff starts working, that stuff's not going to flow from preclinical because actually we won't need it. If stuff starts failing, actually stuff that's in preclinical that looks like the stuff that's failed, that may not go either. So I think there's also that sort of dependency over time, depending on what works and what doesn't. In terms of approval probability and whether the early stuff is likely to be approved or not, I think one of the sort of bottlenecks we've had so far is access to vaccine experts, right? That's what we're working on now. But we have an in-house vaccine expert, and I've talked to one other, and I think they are somewhat torn about whether the sort of puts and takes on probability of success, right? So the things that tend to raise it are the fact that the world will accept a pretty mediocre coronavirus vaccine, right? Doesn't have to be that good. It just has to be not terrible. On the other hand, the level of understanding of the pathogen is remarkably low, right? So usually people develop a vaccine when they know an awful lot about the pathogen and about the normal human immune response to that pathogen, and also the response to the pathogen in a bunch of animal models. And in this case, we don't know that. So their view is that the poor level of understanding of the pathogen and the human immunological response actually makes this difficult. And then there's also at least some US policy people are concerned that if the first vaccine has a safety problem, that's not just a problem for the first vaccine. That's a problem for the second, third, fourth, fifth, sixth, and seventh vaccine. So again, it's a debate we're having. And I think, you know, we, at the moment, we can argue the case both ways. And we need to talk to more people who are sort of actually really in the game of vaccine development.
Yeah, it would be great. Jay, I know you spent a lot of time to elicit probabilities of success, and I would say we have, for example, one of front runners is Moderna. And Moderna has technology which was not approved in vaccine world. And in this case, I mean, we kind of have to weigh all these risks and challenges for vaccine. And for some reason, by the way, I do not anticipate huge growth of different companies in huge growth of vaccine portfolio. Probably all players are already here. But let's see how it goes. We may predict, but I'm not sure how our predictions will be if we extrapolate number of potential candidates. Yeah.
Hi, Jack, Vladimir. Thank you so much. This is Tony Fernandez.
Hey, Tony.
I have a question, and I also have an answer. I don't know which one to go first. I guess the answer is regarding the question that you had on the preclinical, let's say, opportunities that are going on. The answer for that is, you know, sort of like I'm from Chevron, so sort of like an exploration portfolio Since these are preclinical, the only probably thing that is feasible is to discount them, to risk them more. The fact that they're not out there, that they're not clinical, means that that they don't have the same chances of the leading candidates. So maybe that's something that could be done, to discount the ones that are preclinical, to avoid them dominating the whole simulation, especially when they're totally unknown. That's the answer. And then the question is, on the probability of success, there's potentially an opportunity for improvement. It seems to be like a deterministic, either binary success fail, but in reality, surely the simulation will get more complex, but there's probably different tones and shades. There's probably efficacy, there's probably safety. There might be trade-offs. The safety might pertain to different groups of vaccines. So maybe some vaccines that are particularly in one group, as you said, when one vaccine is determined to be unsafe, that might punish all the group of vaccines of that category, but it might not punish other groups of vaccines that are totally different. So I think that there's probably an opportunity to enrich the simulation, but like I said, once you enrich the simulation, you're going to get into more complexities. But you're probably at some point in time, if you can find the compromise to enrich the simulation and not make it too complex, but just add a feature to, like, safety and efficacy, I think that might produce very, very important insights.
I mean, Vladimir, do you want to talk a bit about about the sort of process we're going through to try and get better risk estimates?
Yeah, it's we assumed I assumed that probability of success is the same, is kind of one of risk measures. For example, it's just and we have to come up to some basics. Calculating probability of success, like simple statistical measure, probably in this case at least, doesn't work, and I'm happy to discuss others.
No, but I mean, actually, the work we're doing now, as of the thing we were talking about for an hour and a half this afternoon before this call is, we're designing some survey tools to try and get vaccine experts to rank the candidates on a whole bunch of risk factors. For example, operational issues around manufacturing and scale up, various safety things, various different efficacy measures, the degree to which risk correlates within a technology platform, for example. But I think you're absolutely right about the technology platform thing, and I'd make 2 points from a portfolio perspective. It looks there's 130 candidates, but actually there's only about 8 technology platforms, right? So actually the portfolio in terms of platforms is much less diversified than it is in terms of individual candidates. And if there's substantial correlated risk within platform, right, actually the world doesn't have a terribly diversified vaccine portfolio. And then the second issue is nearly all of the vaccines, not all, but the vast majority of leading vaccines are all going after the same viral antigen. They're going after something called the COVID spike protein, or bits of it. And it may turn out that actually that's the wrong bit of the virus to go for, and there are other bits of the virus that will be much better. So I think the point you made about these clumps of correlated risk is actually a really, really important one to try and understand, because it may be that the world is much less diversified than it thinks it is.
Yes, and Jack is absolutely right. We're going to incorporate dependencies between vaccines in the second release of the model, and probabilities also will be diversified across platforms, plus some kind of adjustments for leading candidates.
Excellent, thank you.
No, thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you. Great question. Thank you.
What software are you using?
For
You did the
what?
Monte Carlo.
For Monte Carlo, we use GPSS.
I see.
GPSSH.
Hi, this is Gary Bush. If I could ask a question of, how will you be updating your data in a learning mode, as these clinical trial results, both pre-announcements and announcements come out regarding the quality of the binding of the antibodies, et cetera?
Right, well, at the moment, I mean, the next step is to try and come up with a decent parameterization, right? So I think the first model was sort of structurally interesting, but it used a very crude set of parameters based on historical probabilities and timing. So the next step is to come up with a better set of probability estimates and a better set of timing estimates, and a more realistic representation of the portfolio with different things in different phases, and run it again, right? And then I think after that, depending on a few things, the aim would be to do some regular releases, right? Exactly how regular they would have to be yet, it's hard to know, for a couple of reasons. One is we don't know how much news is going to be coming out and how quickly. And then also, there are some team constraints that we've got to deal with. So, we are, or my view is, to do this well, we actually need to have some institutional support, right? And we are, in the process of trying to get some sort of institutional support, because, I think it'd be a full-time job for 3, 4, 5 people. Having done something similar in an investment bank, right, where you have to manage, you have to look at the portfolios of drug companies. It changes over time. There's always news, and someday it looks good, someday it looks bad, and people want to talk about the latest stuff. That's actually a lot of work doing the maintenance. So my view is this would be a full-time job for several people if you wanted to do it on a kind of live basis with releases every week or every month.
Yeah, and we also browse a lot of literature and exchange literature, and our interviews with experts are also intended to they have questions about timelines and probabilities. We hope we will not be far from reality.
And to give you a sense, the current team, there's 5 of us working on this now. There's me, there's Vladimir. We've got a guy who used to run R&D portfolio management at the big drug company who's helping us. We've got a guy who worked in the vaccine industry for 40 years who's helping us. And we've got a guy who's a health economist and sort of policy guy who's got a background in infectious diseases who's helping us.
Yeah, and for example, like we have to look proactively because manufacturing and distribution of vaccines would be a kind of huge topic within probably a couple months. See when trials will be progressing. There are tons of outstanding questions.
Have you checked with the Gates Foundation on how they're assessing their portfolio?
I personally tried several times, and they are mostly probably in kind of finding mode, and it's hard to say because they have Gates Foundation in the Washington States and Medical Research Institute here, and in Massachusetts and Cambridge. It's hard to say. Again, I tried to contact them, but so far.
A lot of my time over the last couple of weeks has been spent effectively sort of, talking to people about some sort of institutional support. And I think, if I'm sort of totally blunt, if you talk to people at CEPI, for example, which is the international agency who is managing and coordinating a lot of that, they are so busy, it's just very difficult for them to do anything, right? So it's difficult for them to engage in anything that's more than what they're currently doing. There's some sort of governmental and sort of policy groups in the UK who I'm in conversation with, and some of the sort of biomedical charities. But where it'll go, hard to say. But I do think it's quite interesting. I do think it may be the sorts of things that sort of Vladimir and me have been suggesting should be done from a portfolio management perspective are being done in some places. So it may be that CEPI and BARDA / Gates Foundation / Warp Speed have done some of this stuff. But I think there is still a need for the tools to be in the public domain, because lots of people don't have access to what they're doing. And there's lots of decisions being made around the world which don't have access to their thinking. And also their thinking may not be right? So in a sense, it seems to me it's a bit like epidemiological and public health models. You don't just want one, right? You actually want a diversity, and you want some of them in the public domain.
Yeah, it's Jack, you're right, because sometimes I get emails based on our papers. I got emails that Vladimir, will vaccine be ready in 2 months? No, it's just anecdotal evidence, but it looks like people are not informed.
This is Brian Pike. I have a question for you. In the United States, we keep talking about, oh, there's going to be a vaccine in 12 to 18 months, middle of the year sort of thing. But when I look at your graphs back there on slide 15, I think 14 or something, that would seem like a really optimistic view. I was wondering, what do you think is causing the U.S. to make optimistic views about when a vaccine is going to be available?
I think it depends what you mean by available, right? So if you look at some of the sort of eminent US vaccine policy folks, there's a guy called Peter Hotez. I think his first name is Peter. Google him. He's been doing a lot of TV and interviews about vaccine timelines. And he's, I'd say a lot of the crusty old vaccine folks we talk to or you hear writing, they seem quite cautious about the timelines. And I also think there's a difference between available and would you want to take it, right? Because it may be that things are available under what's called emergency use authorization after phase 2. But the safety problems you get with vaccines are typically relatively rare and can be very serious. And of course, vaccines are sometimes given to lots of very healthy people whose individual risk of the disease will be quite low, right? So there's a real question in my mind, which is how does the world use a vaccine that has been rushed through the R&D process? We actually don't really know its safety profile. So it may be that you would use it only in the high-risk patients, right? So if you're 80 years old and if you get COVID, you've got a 20% chance of dying, then it may well be those people are vaccinated. Another profile that you could imagine is a vaccine that is not particularly immunogenic and doesn't engender an immune response in elderly people who've got bad health system, who've got bad immune systems, right? So it might be this vaccine isn't particularly potent, but if you give it to young people who've got good immune systems, it kind of works. Well, what would you do with that vaccine? What you do is you would use that in healthcare workers and care home workers, right? So that the high-risk patients in whom the vaccine wouldn't work are still protected. So there's a whole bunch of different clinical profiles which might lead to different uses. But I think the idea that there's a vaccine that we give to 300 million Americans in 18 months strikes me as unlikely, even if we have a great vaccine in 18 months, because we won't know it's great in 18 months.
Yeah, and let me add kind of on more optimistic side. Moderna Pharmaceuticals, which is leading candidate in vaccine race, they already made their timeline for clinical trials even more aggressive than they suggested before. And the key issue, they do a lot in terms of at-risk planning of clinical trials. It means that they started like one of our slides indicated. They started next phase even before previous phase ended, and they said instead of starting say phase 3 clinical trial, they said we will start the clinical trial phase 3 in July. It was in one of their announcements, and this is very, very encouraging.
Could I add another comment? Brian, part of it's language as well, and it goes to Jack's comment about crusty old immunologists. Dr. Fauci stated that it's not likely to have a effective vaccine within 12 to 18 months or until. So it's not that it's a positive statement. I think he stated it accurately, and it reflects Vladimir's graph of probability of success.
Yeah, it's again we're trying to refine model based on what data is available.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Brian, I think you're still on mute.
Yeah, I am there. And then no, it's too bad we can't start to communicate in probabilities and distributions rather than these comments that are more easily misinterpreted, especially given the polarization in the United States.
Yeah, probably.
And to be frank, that was one reason why when I started chatting to Vladimir and he showed me this, I thought, you know, from a sort of policy perspective, for example, it's just such a better way of representing what may or may not happen, right? But I couldn't agree more.
Yes, of course. Yeah, I agree.
Could I ask you about the one comment you had of whether the probability changed if there was global coordination versus country by country or company by company? I don't recall hearing your comments on that.
Okay, so I think this is a sort of diversification point, right? So, in fact, Vladimir was rather modest in terms of the publications. We had something in the Financial Times about 3 weeks ago, which was a sort of more policy-oriented rather than technical piece. That's right. It's better to be modest than than otherwise, because I can then remind people. But the point here is, you can imagine that there might be quite a degree of diversification, and sort of at the global level, right? So somewhere in the world, there are several of each of those 7 or 8 platforms being tested, right? So if you analyze your portfolio at a global level, it might look like Vladimir, the graph doesn't look too bad. We will in the world get, a vaccine within 24 months, at least 1, possibly 2, maybe 3. But the problem is, if actually the markets are fragmented, then you've lost most countries have lost that diversification, right? So the UK has 2 leading candidates. Arguably, it might have access to the Glaxo-Sanofi candidate as well, but the UK seems to be making an awful lot of fuss about one particular vaccine. Now, it looks okay. I'm glad they've got one to make a fuss about, but I would much rather they had more than one. And so I'm quite surprised how Europe or some of the major European countries haven't got together and done a kind of barter, just in case, in the unlikely event, were Trump to win the next election, or indeed were Biden to win the next election, and a bunch of vaccines come to market in the US. I have a feeling we probably have to wait a bit for some of those to come across the Atlantic, right? We probably have to wait until you guys have done what you want to do with them. So that's the point I'm making, that lots of parts of the world, the risk profile is actually much worse than it is globally, because there will be fragmentation because of therapeutic nationalism.
Are you then looking at where the vaccines are being, the work is being done to say, okay, these are in the US and these are in Europe and these are over in Asia?
And I think when we publish, particularly for the policy audience, right, they will really want to know the sort of risk profiles by country of origin, or at least region. Yeah.
Yeah, we will see how far we can go.
Gentlemen, so this is Terry. We're at the top of the hour. First of all, I want to thank both of you for a very successful and great first presentation for the Pharma Interest Group. Thank you very much for everything you did. We really appreciate it. The last thing I would just want to announce before we go is that, we're always looking for interesting topics and speakers for this forum. So please get in touch with me if you would like to present at the next one. We would love to have you. So, just send me an email and we can go forward with it. So again, thank you everyone for attending. This now concludes this month's Pharma Interest Group's session, and we'll see you all next month. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you,
Terry, for organizing it.
Thank you.
Okay, I'll be in touch, guys. Bye-bye.
Yeah, thank
Bye.
you.
Thank you. Bye.